welcome to our Bioaz Podcast, the first of our Synbiotic series with Jeff Flood. Jeff's our managing director. He's got a background in physiology, biochemistry, and physiotherapy. Thanks for joining us, Jeff.
My pleasure.
Great. So what I wanted to do in this podcast is actually start from the very top. And as we start talking about the microbiome, the terminology is used everywhere, but it can be interpreted in many different ways and people have different understandings. So I just wanted to start from the top and just explain the microbiome.
It's a big question to start with straight away, right? Yeah. So the microbiome, if let's keep it simple to begin with. There is us, and then there are organisms that come along with us. And these organisms can be on your skin, in your mouth, in your eyes, up your nose, all through your gastrointestinal tract, where most people think of them. But they can be any part of your body that has any access to the external world. That's where the microbiome resides. And not just on the surface, it can be actually under the surface as well. For example, in the skin, they can be down a centimetre into your skin. And what we're talking about are organisms, not just bacteria, but also bacteriophages, which are like viruses that are, or small encapsulated genetic pieces of material that the bacteria kind of share between each other. It can also be yeasts, so like fungi and eukaryotes and all sorts of different organisms, including small insects on your skin. And this also would include parasites that are in your gut. So eukaryote organisms like even worms, you could say, are part of your microbiome or your microbiota. The microbiome is actually the combination of all the genetic material from all those things. So those two words, you'll hear them interchange all the time, microbiome. If we just say microbiome, it's easy. You're talking about all the organisms, all the genetic material included.
Yeah, well, that's pretty comprehensive in terms of what it is. What does a healthy microbiome look like? What do we need to see?
Really good question. Again, a huge question to answer, because what's good for one person may not be necessarily good for another. And someone who's really well, if you look at their microbiome, it might be completely different to someone else who's completely well. So an example of that is if you look at some of the hunter-gatherer tribes in Africa, and they've done microbiome analytics on them, and they compared them to super healthy people in the Western world, completely different microbiomes. Completely different levels of biodiversity, different organisms. The metabolomics, so the chemicals or the molecules produced by the microbiome, completely different. So the hunter-gatherers in Africa live these, incredible traditional lifestyles that's been around for thousands of years, probably represent what we looked like 10,000 years ago. And whereas the Western world is a reflection of decisions we make based on the food and beverage, other things, the environment we are exposing ourselves to, if you're in the more developed world. What's healthy for one is different for the other. And what we need to think about when we think about the microbiome is, you look at our cells as an organism, as a human, a living man or woman or child, we have a genetic code, we have a genome ourselves. And then that genome, if you think of it like keys on a piano, there's all this potential music that can be played, all these potential molecules or things that can be produced from our own DNA. And the way our body does that, it goes in and reads the specific part, and it produces that protein, for example. So if you think of piano, you put the music up, okay, I need you to play this piece of music, and then you hit the appropriate keys, and the music emanates from the piano. So for a cell in our body, I want this particular protein. So in we go and we open up the genome, we open up the DNA, and we go in and we read the pieces we need, and a protein's expressed. How we express ourselves is directly connected to our microbiome and directly connected to all the choices we make in our life and the environment that we find ourselves in. And when I talk about choices, environments, right down to even what friends we have, if we have a pet, anything you can think about that is part of the human or the living experience, that will impact your microbiome, and that will impact what genetic material is in your microbiome, what chemicals are produced by it, how they interact with us, and that helps us express ourselves. So two twins, identical twins, born at the same time, put in different environments, will express their genetics completely differently. We'll see that. And part of that is actually the microbiome. Some of it's other things, but a lot of it's the microbiome.
On the back of that, the expression of that, I want to kind of just touch on that diversity. I assume it's like the microbiome is just like an ecosystem. It's like a forest. The greater diversity, the healthier is. That's my interpretation. How true is that?
Oh, absolutely. So they often talk about pine forest, for example. In a pine forest, it's a conifer desert.
Yeah.
Because the biodiversity is limited, and a lot of inputs are put into keeping the biodiversity down underneath the canopy, so poisoning weeds and do all sorts, so you just get trees growing. So yeah, it's like a desert. It's just one. Correct. So for us to be well, generally we want biodiversity. Yeah. We want as biodiverse as possible microbiome. That the reason for that is not biodiversity, but for biodiversity's sake, but it's because of genetic material. So you don't want a piano with only 4 keys on it. You're not going to be able to play. You play music, but you're not going to play a lot of variety on that. But if you have a full piano, well, you can play any piece of music that you're given. And it's the same for your microbiome. The more biodiversity is, generally the more genetic material, the more genes available, and so the more potential molecules that can be produced, or the more interactions we can have with our microbiome. And so therefore, it can produce any kind of music we need to engage our own genome to help us express ourselves in a way that's healthy and I guess vital.
In gaining the diversity, I listened to you do a speech which was to a room full of beauty therapists, clinic owners and spa owners, and you told them to start gardening to get dirty. Now, the look on their face was priceless when you said that, but I want to understand the reason and the logic behind that.
Yeah. So, they thought that, well, their whole industry is about being clean and beautiful. And of course, I told them to go out and get some mud on them and get dirt under their fingernails. Okay, so the reason we haven't just, we didn't just get plonked on this planet. We've evolved, and we've evolved not to be an isolated organism. We are a reflection of the ecosystem, which is kind of what I was talking about before. Let me go back a little bit. If I asked you to separate, show me where you start and the rest of the world begins, it's almost impossible for you to do that. Because without our microbiome, you're dead. That's how important it is for us. So is it part of us or is it not part of us? Okay, so if it has to be part of us, because without it, we're not surviving. So if it's part of us, where does my microbiome finish? And where does my microbiome start? Where is that interface between my microbiome, which is, if you like, almost like an organ system for me? Where does it start? Where does it finish? Well, that's impossible to determine because I'm breathing in bacteria constantly. They're hitting my skin. Everything I eat's got them on them. Are those bacteria that are coming on me separate to me? So yeah, they're separate to it. But my microbiome is a constant reflection of where I am in the world and who I'm dealing with and what I'm touching and doing and eating and thinking, and every single part of me and what makes me a living man, every part of that is impacting my microbiome. So it becomes really difficult to discern it. So we've kind of, the way we operate is we operate best when we have a more biodiverse microbiome that's got as much material in there as possible with as much information. The soil, if you think of a soil ecosystem, it's the same. So when you're growing a plant, let's say you're growing some spinach at home in your veggie garden, the spinach isn't growing well, you don't think necessarily about the spinach, you start thinking about the soil. Right, I've improved the soil, I'll put some compost in there and I'll increase the richness or the value of that soil. What you're actually doing is you're putting things into the soil that increase the actual biodiversity and the number of microbiota that are participating in that soil. So you're increasing the fungi, you're increasing the bacteria, you're increasing all that organic material in the soil because that's how the plant gets its minerals and its nutrients, it's the stuff out of the soil through the microbiome in the soil. So if you don't do that, you're not really helping the plant. So half of our microbiome, half of our microbiota is spore-forming bacteria. Now, these are bacteria that most people, when they think about bacteria, it's like a jelly bag, and then when it wants to split to two, like we learnt biology at school, it pinches off, and now we've got two, they're the same, and then they grow, and then they split. Yeah, that's called a vegetative cycle, right? So it's vegetative reproduction cycle. But some bacteria, when they're faced with challenging situations, so it could be they're hot, or they're really cold, or they don't have enough nutrient, they would die off if they stayed in that vegetative, that jelly bag state. So what they do is they have the capacity to produce a spore, or a really hard, small seed-like structure. And that spore, when it's produced, so the mother cell, instead of producing a baby cell that looks just like her, she would produce a little tiny hard spore, and the mother cell will die. Now, this spore can sit dormant for decades, if necessary, in the right environment. And it's waiting. It's waiting for the right situation, the right environmental conditions to occur, and then it's called outgrowth. It triggers outgrowth. It outgrows, and then it goes back into a vegetative reproduction cycle, and so that jelly bags on. Half of those spore-forming bacteria in our gut. Now, these spore formers, a lot of them come from the soil. And you can imagine those hunter-and-gatherers I was talking about before, when they go into a new area and it's full of lots of fruit and vegetables, there's a lot of wildlife, like the environment's abundant and it's healthy, they will get a lot of spore-forming bacteria into their gastrointestinal tract and on them and in their lungs and everywhere, because it's a reflection of the abundance in that environment. And those spore-forming bacteria, when they get into our gut, they vegetate, they provide information. What we see is kids in the city versus kids in the country. The kids in the city have less biodiversity than the kids in the country. It's because the kids in the country are exposed to the soil all the time. They're picking up all these soil-forming, all the soil-based organisms, majority of them spore-forming bacteria. And those spore-forming bacteria don't necessarily stay in us. They kind of transition through us. They create this environment that helps us have a more biodiverse and abundant, healthy microbiome. So the reason I say get dirty is by getting dirty in the soil, like growing your own vegetables, as well as growing your own vegetables. Not only are you breathing, getting it on your skin, but also when you grow those veggies and eat them, you're eating it as well. So that if you have really healthy, abundant, organic, natural soil that you're growing your own veggies, it can be as simple as growing lettuce. You're actually giving yourself a probiotic supplement every single day that you're out there tending to your veggie garden and getting dirty, getting it on your skin and ingesting it. And as long as you keep an abundant, healthy soil that's producing really healthy vegetable matter, then you're constantly getting a healthy probiotic supplement. In those hunters and gatherers, when that environment became less abundant, it wasn't producing that, they get less of that probiotic, and that starts to signal, hey, you need to move on because this is in a healthy environment. And that's one of the things that would trigger them through gut brain to move on. So yeah, my thing to get dirty is grow your own veggies, get dirty, eat your own veggies, and you're constantly reconnecting to where we came from, reconnecting to nature and how we're meant to work.
You've just started to touch on there what I wanted to talk about the next question. You mentioned hunters and gatherers, kids from the country, abundant soil. But that's not necessarily the life that everybody lives in at the moment. Like modern life is kind of very different. So can you kind of just go through some of the other factors that, someone from the city, what are the different factors that are going to impact the health of their microbiome?
Wow, just about everything. Originally, we were barefoot out in the bush, surviving, finding our food. Every time you went hunting, probably 1 in 20, 1 in 30 times you were successful in bringing something home. It wasn't every day you went out and hunted and found some animal meat, some product to come back. Most of the time, you're just relying on what you could gather in the area. So our gut and our systems, our organ systems are designed around the phytonutrients and the fiber that's in plant material. And so a hunter-gatherer can have as much as 100 grams of fiber a day in their diet, sometimes more. It's a lot more. I mean, I think the dose per day they recommend is somewhere between 3 to 10 grams, depends on what country you're in. That's nothing compared to what 100 gathering. So that's where we've come from. So anything from that is starting to modify things, and not necessarily always in a negative way, but it's modifying it. So in the city, when we don't go gathering much, and we definitely don't go hunting, or usually not. So going down to Woolies doesn't count. So when we go into the supermarket, we're just buying what's available to us. And if you look at most people's plates, because you're 100% successful when you go hunting for protein at Woolworths, generally everyone every meal will have some meat or some animal-based products, animal proteins, and then you'll have some. That's changing. People are having more plant material now. But generally, you're always going to be successful. So our diet as a start in any developed, and not even Western world, even, developing nations, if you live in an urban environment, your diet is going to be different to what it would be if you're outside those urban environments in a rural environment. So our dietary choices are quite different. And because of where we live and a lot of the cities and the logistics, etc., to get food to us, it will often have to come through processing. So, and the processing has food regulations around it to make sure it's shelf stable and safe for us to consume. We're not poisoning people with food that's been contaminated or gone off in some way. And they'll have preservatives, or it might have emulsifiers in there. There's all sorts of things that get put into food to make it safe to get it to our shelf or fridge at home and then to consume. And all those things start detracting from the nutritional value, but also the value to our microbiota. And so there's a real challenge for food supply. So anyone living in the city is going to have food choices put in front of them that are going to be compromised compared or different compared to normal. Every single one of those choices will change your microbiome. Stress massively changes your microbiome. Just meditating will change your microbiome. Just being stressed, having friends you don't like will change your microbiome. Having a pet, not having a pet changes your microbiome. If you live in an apartment versus a townhouse or a house where you have a yard, changes your microbiome. All of the, do you exercise and sweat? Do you play sport? Do you hug people? Do you shake hands? All these things are impacting constantly what microorganisms we're exposed to and what the profile of our microbiome is, which means the genetic material available to us, or the keys on the piano, which then affects what kind of music gets played between us, our genome and our microbiome's genome, and they'll tell you what kind of health or ill health you're going to have.
So I've got one more question in terms of this podcast, and you started mentioning shaking hands, contact, hugging people. Slightly controversial, but what impact did the pandemic have on our microbiome across the world?
Yeah, massive. Well, the first thing, locking people into their houses to keep away from each other may make sense from that perspective, like from a pandemic. But it also removed us from other people, and that interaction with other people is really important for our biodiversity, and not just the organisms that remain in us, but as positive participants, but also reduce the incidence of us encountering negative impacts. Organisms that would cause problems for us that our immune system needs to respond to, because our immune system is constantly learning about what's in the environment and working out what's a positive thing for us and what we should be responding to and keeping away from us. So when most people have a sniffly nose or a cough, they think, I'm sick. What you're actually experiencing is your body expelling or getting rid of your immune system responding to something that it believes shouldn't be there. And so the cough or the sniff isn't the illness, it's your body responding to something else that's your body's decided shouldn't be in your system. It's actually your immune system operating appropriately. So not being exposed to people is a big issue. Hand sanitizers. Now, those sanitizers were to destroy microorganisms, virus, things that are on your hand. It's destroyed as good and bad. There's no discernment between killing off the microorganisms that are really good for us versus not so good for us. So you see a lot of people with terrible skin problems on their hands now, and face masks. We're not meant to be rebreathing in. Hypercapnia is an issue. So CO2 levels are really high. That changes the microbiome in your mouth and your lungs, changes the way your odontoblast produce the minerals to remineralize your teeth and the demineralization of your teeth. There's some very significant changes that happen in your microbiome just by wearing a mask. And you see a lot of people getting facial, skin breakouts and stuff, and breath issues and teeth issues and cardiovascular issues. Just the mask alone could do that. I understand why people were advised to do that, but nothing is always perfect, right? There's always pros and cons with every kind of piece of advice you get, and it's about weighing all that up. I think the other thing is people became scared about touching other things and surfaces and the threat that the natural environment presents to them. And whilst that's not a direct impact, you would say, on your microbiome, it will change your behavioural patterns, and that will have a negative impact on your microbiome. You're meant to hug people, shake hands with people, kiss people. You're meant to go out, have a coffee. You're meant to, drop your piece of cake on the table and shake it off 3-second rule or whatever and eat it. That's natural, right? But a lot of people now feel like if I do that, I'm at this incredible risk of becoming unwell. And I think that wasn't a great outcome from a lot of different advice that we got. So yeah, it's definitely going to have an impact.
I think just your response there really does highlight the impact it did have. But some of the thoughts you've been saying is just like, it should be quite liberating for us, because we do, in the modern world, we do feel we've got the term germaphobes.
Yeah.
And but that probably inhibits like our natural biome, getting that natural biodiversity, so I mean, a lot of those comments are really, they're refreshing, and I think that should be liberating for many of us. But that's all we've got time for on this one today. You started touching on a couple of topics around immunity, oral health. Lucky we've got 4 more of these to go through. All right, thanks, Jeff.
No problems.